following sermon was delivered at the 10:30 worship service at the United Methodist Church of Kent. Please enjoy.
Historically and traditionally, this season of Lent we are now in connects to our sacrament of baptism. For it is in our baptism that we are reminded who we are, fundamentally God's beloved children living in communion with all creation. And it is in our baptism that we awaken to our call to live like it, to live that way, by grace in the way of Christ, embracing the world in love and inhabiting beloved community, living compassionately and courageously, gently and generously, living peaceably and justly day by day. That is who we are. That's what we are created for. And yet, that way of living is not always easy, as we well know. It can feel quite contrary to the flow of our own tendencies and certainly of the world around us. And so there are times in our lives when we need to be encouraged, as in today's first reading from Philippians, encouraged to stand firm in the Lord, encouraged to hang in there, in other words, to keep living faithfully, to keep loving broadly when we might be tempted otherwise to throw in the towel. And there are times when our standing firm in this world will mean resisting those other, more harmful ways of living, beginning always in ourselves and then reaching outward. One of the promises of our baptism is to accept the freedom and power God gives us to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. Being a healing presence in the world sometimes means resisting the harm. Today's gospel provides an image for us of what our resistance to harm might be. The context for the story is this contrast between Herod, who is Rome's appointed ruler in the region, and Jesus. The contrast between their two very different ways of living. In fact, the contrast could hardly be drawn any sharper than it is. You have Herod, who represents imperial colonialism, and then Jesus, who represents beloved community. You have Herod, who has soldiers, and Jesus, who has companions. Herod, who commands, and Jesus, who serves. Herod, who threatens and punishes his enemies, and Jesus, who prays for, forgives, and loves his. The contrast between the two is stark, and it is deliberate. For all of Jesus' life and ministry is this clear demonstration of active resistance, offering beloved community as the alternative to colonial violence and greed. And yet Jerusalem, Jesus says today, Jerusalem is not interested in beloved community. They would rather keep playing Rome's game. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, Jesus cries in our gospel, you who kill the prophets and stone those who were sent to you, that is, God's messengers who invited you into beloved community. His voice catches with tears as he longs desperately for us to live more openly. How often I have wanted, longed, desired to gather you as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you didn't want that. They didn't want to be gathered under their mother's wings, for they preferred their wily fox, Herod, and his projection of strength through violence, which is, after all, just about the only sort of strength we ever tend to trust. And so Jesus laments our refusal to be who we're meant to be. And in so doing, he demonstrates for us where our faithful resistance begins. It begins in lament. It begins in this prophetic act of truth-telling, naming the reality of where we are, acknowledging the gaps between our lives and world as they now are and our lives and world as they are meant to be, naming them not for the sake of judgment or punishment, but to be honest about the brokenness in our communities and our participation in it. Because, as James Baldwin so famously wrote, nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so Jesus faces Jerusalem, and Jesus tells the truth about it, its complicity, its participation in Rome's brutality. Faced with the choice between colonialism and community, folks have chosen the former. Faced with the choice between Herod the fox and Jesus the hen, we still often choose the former. On the Mount of Olives, opposite the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, there is a chapel now built at the spot where tradition says that Jesus offered this lament. The wall of the chapel behind the altar is all of it glass, providing a clear view of the city, presumably Jesus' view as he wept for it. On the altar itself is this mosaic of a bright and fierce-looking rooster with a flock of chicks underneath its outspread wings, which is, I think, a curious and a very telling thing, that it is a rooster and not a hen. For Jesus very clearly says hen, and yet we prefer roosters. For roosters exercise their strength through violence. Some years ago, on a summer mission trip in southeast Kentucky, I remember building a shed in someone's yard. Living in that yard where we were building was a fighting rooster chained to a spike in the ground, just like a guard dog might be. Roosters can be fierce. They're seemingly built to fight with those sharp spikes on the backs of their feet. They can peck pretty hard too, and they usually don't wait for someone else to peck them first. And yet Jesus in today's story, while being warned about this looming fox, Jesus does not compare himself to a rooster. No, he says he is a hen, and that his strength won't be through fighting the fox, but through sheltering the chicks instead. What Jesus names here is how a hen fluffs herself up, placing her own body between the fox and the chicks. About the best she can hope for in so doing is to satisfy the fox's appetite, so he'll leave her chicks alone. Now for us, as for those who first heard it, that might be a rather surprising image for our resistance, not through violence, but through self-giving. In some sense, maybe it's a little comforting of an image, all fluffy and warm feathers, but in terms of actual effectiveness in the real world as we imagine it, it leaves a little something to be desired. When the foxes of the world start prowling close to our homes, when we can hear them, feel them, threatening ourselves and others, we tend to prefer something much more aggressive than a hen. A more militarized police force in our neighborhood, for example, or a handgun in our bedside table, or an iron dome over our heads. Certainly not a hen house. About a decade ago, in Jerusalem, in fact, I remember being shown a small chunk of wood that supposedly was part of Jesus' cross. As the story was told to me by the person who was showing it to me, Jesus' cross went missing for more than 1,000 years. But then, during the Crusades, some of the invading Europeans started searching for and collecting old relics. In the case of Jesus' cross, they kept testing old-looking pieces of wood by touching them to folks who were sick. Finally, they claimed to have found the real piece by its healing power. And when they found it, can you guess what they did with it? They didn't keep healing folks. No, of course, they carried that old chunk of wood with them into battle to guarantee their success. You see, the truth is, we are addicted to such images. We are addicted in our movies, our stories, in our own lives to images of protection or strength through violence. For the most part, it's the only sort of protection we'll ever even try. Imagining that force must always be resisted with force, or violence with violence, or inhumanity with more of the same. But in the process, though, we just end up catching the very disease we're trying to resist, multiplying violence, perpetuating harm. And so Jesus, this morning, and especially throughout these coming weeks, Jesus demonstrates for us a very, very different way. Jesus absolutely intends to protect the chicks from the foxes, but not by becoming a fox himself. He refuses to fight harm with harm, refuses to fight bullets with bombs. He stands firm in who he is. Just a few weeks from now, when Herod and his police will come looking for Jesus and his flock, Jesus won't produce any weapons to try and stop him. As he is being detained, when one of his own disciples, in fact, pulls a sword out to attempt violent resistance, Jesus will turn the other cheek instead. "Stop," he says to the one with the sword, and in a word for all times, no more of this. No more. Instead of resisting violence with violence, or cruelty with cruelty, instead of becoming the harm he is resisting, Jesus sets himself between the fox and his flock, all fluffed up and hunkered down, just like a mother hen. That is Jesus' model of faithful resistance, standing firm, hanging on, not opposing dehumanizing rhetoric or policies by reacting in kind, not hating perceived enemies or even wishing them ill, but holding fast to compassion and peace. Faithful resistance is not exercising power against, but embracing God's power to be with. Not strength through violence, but strength through solidarity. Not the power of tooth and claw, but the power of a mother hen. Which, to be honest, may not look all that powerful to us. For indeed, in Jesus' story itself, on Friday and Saturday, what we'll call Good Friday and Holy Saturday, it didn't look good at all for that hen. Her feathers were scattered all over the place. The chicks had run away. But then as Sunday dawned, at least a few folks started to see what their mother had done. She had refused to run and hide from the foxes and refused to become a fox herself. Having loved her own who were in the world, she loved them completely, perfectly, to the end. She died as a mother hen. And then she came back to her chicks, still marked with scars, so we would get the picture. All the ferocity of the world's foxes cannot kill the hen's love for her flock. And while we, who will follow her, we might very well have to go through what she went through in our faithful resistance to the harm of this world, yet even as we do so, her wings remain outstretched over us, sheltering us with a love that never ends. That is faithful resistance, being who we are and who we're called to be. We are not called to be a fox, not even a rooster, but a big, brooding hen, offering warmth and shelter and solidarity with all kinds of chicks, maybe even a few ducks, even a fox, so far as he's willing. A mother hen standing firm as beloved community, planting ourselves in whatever ways we can between all the world's foxes and all the vulnerable chicks, refusing to run from the foxes and refusing to become one too. Accepting the freedom and power God gives us to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in ourselves and then in the world. This isn't about fighting back, and it isn't about getting even. It's about courage, real courage, living with open hearts, simply and steadfastly inhabiting beloved community day by day, providing shelter for all who will receive it in the spirit of our mother hen. Thanks be to God. Amen.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the United Methodist Church of Kent Sermon Podcast. For more information about the church, visit www.kentmethodist.org.